Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Written by J.K. Rowling. Read by Caroline Bridgman. Chapter 1. Owl Post. Harry was a highly unusual boy in many ways. For one thing, he hated the summer holidays more than any other time of the year. For another, he really wanted to do his homework, but was forced to do it in secret in the dead of night. And he also happened to be a wizard. It was nearly midnight, and he was lying on his front in bed, the blankets drawn right over his head like a tent, a torch in one hand, and a large leather-bound book, The History of Magic, by Adalbert Wolfing, propped open against the pillow. Harry moved the tip of his eagle feather quill down the page, frowning as he looked for something that would help him write his essay. Witch burning in the 14th century was completely pointless. He discussed.
Come here!
The quill paused at the top of a likely-looking paragraph. Harry pushed his round glasses up his nose, moved his torch closer to the book, and read. Non-magic people, more commonly known as muggles, were particularly afraid of magic in medieval times, but not very good at recognizing it. On the rare occasion that they did catch a real witch or wizard, burning had no effect whatsoever. The witch or wizard would perform a basic flame-freezing charm, and then pretend to shriek with pain while enjoying a gentle tickling sensation. Indeed, Wendelin the Weird enjoyed being burnt so much that she allowed herself to be caught no fewer than 47 times in various disguises. Harry put his quill between his teeth and reached underneath his pillow for his ink bottle and a roll of parchment. Slowly and very carefully, he unscrewed the ink bottle, dipped his quill into it, and began to write, pausing every now and then to listen, because if any of the Dursleys heard the scratching of his quill on their way to the bathroom, he'd probably find himself locked in the cupboard under the stairs for the rest of the summer. The Dursley family of number 4 Privet Drive was the reason that Harry never enjoyed his summer holidays. Uncle Vernon, Aunt Petunia, and their son, Dudley, were Harry's only living relatives. They were muggles, and they had a very medieval attitude towards magic. Harry's dead parents, who had been a witch and wizard themselves, were never mentioned under the Dursleys' roof. For years, Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon had hoped that if they kept Harry as downtrodden as possible, they would be able to squash the magic out of him. To their fury, they had been unsuccessful, and now lived in terror of anyone finding out that Harry had spent most of the last 2 years at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The most the Dursleys could do these days was to lock away Harry's spellbooks, wand, cauldron, and broomstick at the start of the summer holidays, and forbid him to talk to the neighbors. This separation from his spellbooks had been a real problem for Harry, because his teachers at Hogwarts had given him a lot of holiday work. One of the essays, a particularly nasty one about shrinking potions, was for Harry's least favorite teacher, Professor Snape, who'd be delighted to have an excuse to give Harry detention for a month. Harry had therefore seized his chance in the first week of the holidays. Whilst Uncle Vernon, Aunt Petunia, and Dudley had gone out into the front garden to admire Uncle Vernon's new company car in very loud voices so that the rest of the street would notice too, Harry had crept downstairs, picked the lock on the cupboard under the stairs, grabbed some of his books, and hidden them in his bedroom. As long as he didn't leave spots of ink on the sheets, the Dursleys would never know that he was studying magic by night. Harry was keen to avoid trouble with his aunt and uncle at the moment, as they were already in a bad mood with him, all because he'd received a telephone call from a fellow wizard 1 week into the school holidays. Ron Weasley, who was one of Harry's best friends at Hogwarts, came from a whole family of wizards. This meant that he knew a lot of things Harry didn't, but he had never used a telephone before. Most unluckily, it had been Uncle Vernon who had answered the call.
Vernon Dursley speaking.
Harry, who happened to be in the room at the time, froze as he heard Ron's voice answer.
Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? I want to talk to Harry Potter.
Ron was yelling so loudly that Uncle Vernon jumped and held the receiver a foot away from his ear, staring at it with an expression of mingled fury and alarm.
Who is this?
He roared in the direction of the mouthpiece.
Who are you? Ron Weasley,
Ron bellowed back, as though he and Uncle Vernon were speaking from opposite ends of a football pitch.
I'm a friend of Harry's from school.
Uncle Vernon's small eyes swiveled around to Harry, who was rooted to the spot.
There is no Harry Potter here,
he roared, now holding the receiver at arm's length, as though frightened it might explode. "I don't know what school you're talking about.
First, you must learn to
Never
harvest
contact
what
me
you
again.
need from your surroundings
Don't you
in
come
order
near
to
my
survive.
family."
Find some
He threw the
bushes,
receiver back
trees,
onto the telephone,
or even some
as
barrels
if
and
dropping
strike
a
them
poisonous
to
spider.
gather useful items.
The route that had followed had been one of the worst ever. "How dare you give this number to people like you!" Uncle Vernon had roared, spraying Harry with spit. Ron obviously realized that he'd got Harry into trouble, because he hadn't called again. Harry's other best friend from Hogwarts, Hermione Granger, hadn't been in touch either. Harry suspected that Ron had warned Hermione not to call, which was a pity, because Hermione, the cleverest witch in Harry's ear, had Muggle parents, knew perfectly well how to use a telephone, and would probably have had enough sense not to say she went to Hogwarts. So Harry had had no word from any of his wizarding friends for 5 long weeks, and this summer was turning out to be almost as bad as the last one. There was just one very small improvement. After swearing that he wouldn't use her to send letters to any of his friends, Harry had been allowed to let his owl, Hedwig, out at night. Uncle Vernon had given in because of the racket Hedwig made if she was locked in her cage all the time. Harry finished writing about Wendell and the Weird, and paused to listen again. The silence in the dark house was broken only by the distant grunting snores of his enormous cousin, Dudley. It must be very late. Harry's eyes were itching with tiredness. Perhaps he'd finish this essay tomorrow night. He replaced the top of the ink bottle, pulled an old pillowcase from under his bed, put the torch, a history of magic, his essay, quill, and ink inside it, got out of bed, and hid the lot under a loose floorboard under his bed. Then he stood up, stretched, and checked the time on the luminous alarm clock on his bedside table. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. Harry's stomach gave a funny jolt. He'd been 13 years old without realizing it, for a whole hour. Yet another unusual thing about Harry was how little he looked forward to his birthdays. He had never received a birthday card in his life. The Dursleys had completely ignored his last 2 birthdays, and he had no reason to suppose they would remember this one. Harry walked across the dark room, past Hedwig's large, empty cage, to the open window. He leaned on the sill, the cool night air pleasant on his face after a long time under the blankets. Hedwig had been absent for 2 nights now. Harry wasn't worried about her. She'd been gone for this long before, but he hoped she'd be back soon.
What can I do for you?
She was the only living creature in this house who didn't flinch at the sight of him. Harry, though still rather small and skinny for his age, had grown a few inches over the last year. His jet black hair, however, was just as it always has been, stubbornly untidy, whatever he did to it. The eyes behind his glasses were bright green.
Come
On
here!
his forehead, clearly visible through his hair, was a thin scar, shaped like a bolt of lightning. Of all the unusual things about Harry, this scar was the most extraordinary of all. It was not, as the Dursleys had pretended for 10 years, a souvenir of the car crash that had killed Harry's parents, because Lily and James Potter had not died in a car crash. They had been murdered by the most feared dark wizard for 100 years, Lord Voldemort. Harry had escaped from the same attack with nothing more than a scar on his forehead, when Voldemort's curse, instead of killing him, had rebounded upon its originator. Barely alive, Voldemort had fled. But Harry had come face to face with them since at Hogwarts. Remembering their last meeting as he stood at the dark window, Harry had to admit he was lucky even to have reached his 13th birthday. He scanned the starry sky for a sign of Hedwig, perhaps soaring back to him with a dead mouse dangling from her beak, expecting praise. Gazing absently over the rooftops,
Come
it was a
here!
few seconds before Harry realized what he was seeing. Silhouetted against the golden moon, and growing larger every moment, was a large, strangely lopsided creature, and it was flapping in Harry's direction. Harry stood quite still, watching it sink lower and lower. For a split second, he hesitated, his hand on the window latch,
What can I do for you?
wondering whether to slam it shut. But then the bizarre creature soared over one of the street lamps of Privet Drive, and Harry, realizing what it was, leapt aside. Through the window soared 3 owls, 2 of them holding up the third, which appeared to be unconscious. They landed with a soft thump on Harry's bed, and the middle owl, which was large and grey, keeled over and lay motionless. There was a large package tied to its legs. Harry recognized the unconscious owl at once. His name was Errol, and he belonged to the Weasley family. Harry dashed to the bed at once, untied the cords around Errol's legs, took off the parcel, and then carried Errol to Hedwig's cage.
Shall we have a drink,
Errol
friend?
opened one bleary eye, gave a feeble hoot of thanks, and began to gulp some water. Harry turned back to the remaining owls. One of them, the large, snowy female, was his own Hedwig. She too was carrying a parcel, and looked extremely pleased with herself. She gave Harry an affectionate nip with her beak, as he removed her burden, then flew across the room to join Errol. Harry didn't recognize the third owl, a handsome tawny one, but he knew at once where it had come from, because in addition to a third parcel, it was carrying a letter bearing the Hogwarts crest. When Harry relieved this owl of its post, it ruffled its feathers importantly, stretched its wings, and took off through the open window into the night. Harry sat down in his bed, grabbed Errol's package, ripped off the brown paper, and discovered a present wrapped in gold, and his first ever birthday card. Fingers trembling slightly, he opened the envelope. 2 pieces of paper fell out, a letter and a newspaper cutting. The cutting had clearly come out of the wizarding newspaper, the Daily Prophet, because the people in the black and white picture were moving. Harry picked up the cutting, smoothed it out, and read, Ministry of Magic Employee Scoops Grand Prize. Arthur Weasley, head of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office of the Ministry of Magic, has won the annual Daily Prophet Grand Prize Galleon Draw. A delighted Mr. Weasley told the Daily Prophet, We will be spending the gold on a summer holiday in Egypt, where our eldest son, Bill, works as a curse breaker for Gringotts Wizarding Bank. The Weasley family will be spending a month in Egypt, returning for the start of the new school year at Hogwarts, which 5 of the Weasley children currently attend. Harry scanned the moving photograph, and a grin spread across his face as he saw all 9 of the Weasleys waving furiously at him, standing in front of a large pyramid. Plump little Mrs. Weasley, tall, balding Mr. Weasley, 6 sons and 1 daughter. All, though the black and white picture didn't show it, with flaming red hair. Right in the middle of the picture was Ron, tall and gangly.
Come
With
here!
his pet rat Scabbers on his shoulder, and his arm around his little sister Ginny. Harry couldn't think of anyone who deserved to win a large pile of gold more than the Weasleys, who were very nice and extremely poor. He picked up Ron's letter and unfolded it. Dear Harry, happy birthday. Look, I'm really sorry about that telephone call. I hope the Muggles didn't give you a hard time. I asked Dad, and he reckoned I shouldn't have shouted. It's brilliant here in Egypt. Bill's taken us around all the tombs, and you wouldn't believe the curses those old Egyptian wizards put on them. Mum wouldn't let Ginny come in the last one. There were all these mutant skeletons in there, of Muggles who'd broken in and grown extra heads and stuff. I couldn't believe it when Dad won the Daily Prophet.
Shall we have a drink, friend?
700 galleons. Most of it's gone on this holiday, but they're going to buy me a new wand for next year. Harry remembered only too well the occasion when Ron's old wand had snapped. It had happened when the car the 2 of them had been flying to Hogwarts had crashed into a tree in the school grounds. We'll be back around a week before the term starts.
What can I do for
I'm going
you?
up to London to get my wand and our new books. Any chance of meeting you there? Don't let the Muggles get you down. Try and come to London, Ron. P.S. Percy's head boy. He got the letter last week. Harry glanced back at the photograph. Percy, who was in his 7th and final year at Hogwarts, was looking particularly smug. He had pinned his head boy badge to the fez, perched jauntily on top of his neat hair. His horn-rimmed glasses flashed in the Egyptian sun. Harry now turned to his present and unwrapped it. Inside was what looked like a miniature glass spinning top. There was another note from Ron beneath it. Harry, this is a pocket sneakoscope. If there's something untrustworthy around, it's supposed to light up and spin. Bill says it's rubbish, sold for wizard tourists, and isn't reliable, because it kept lighting up at dinner last night. But he didn't realize Fred and George had put beetles in his soup. Bye, Ron. Harry put the pocket sneakoscope on his bedside table, where it stood quite still, balanced on its point, reflecting the luminous hands of his clock. He looked at it happily for a few seconds, then picked up the parcel Hedwig had brought. Inside this too was a wrapped present, a card, and a letter, this time from Hermione. Dear Harry, Ron wrote to me and told me about his phone call to your Uncle Vernon. I do hope you're all right. I'm on holiday in France at the moment, and I didn't know how I was
What
going
can
to
I do
send
for you?
What if they'd opened it at customs? But then Hedwig turned up. I think she wanted to make sure you got something for your birthday for a change. I bought your present by owl order. There was an advertisement in the Daily Prophet. I've been getting it delivered. It's so good to keep up with what's going on in the wizarding world. Did you see that picture of Ron and his family a week ago? I bet he's learning loads. I'm really jealous. The ancient Egyptian wizards were fascinating. There's some interesting local history of witchcraft here, too. I've rewritten my whole history of magic essay to include some of the things I've found out. I hope it's not too long. It's 2 rolls of parchment more than Professor Binns asked for. Ron says he's going to be in London in the last week of the holidays. Can you make it? Will your aunt and uncle let you come? I really hope you can. If not, I'll see you on the Hogwarts Express on September the 1st. Love from Hermione. P.S. Ron says Percy's head boy. I'll bet Percy's really pleased. Ron doesn't seem too happy about it. Harry laughed again as he put Hermione's letter aside and picked up her present. It was very heavy. Knowing Hermione, he was sure it would be a large book full of very difficult spells. But it wasn't. His heart gave a huge bound as he ripped back the paper and saw a sleek black leather case with silver words stamped across it. Broomstick Servicing Kit. Wow, Hermione, Harry whispered, unzipping the case to look inside. There was a large jar of Fleetwood's high finish handle polish, a pair of gleaming silver tailed twig clippers, a tiny brass compass to clip onto your broom for long journeys, and a handbook of do-it-yourself broom care. Aside from his friends, the thing that Harry missed most about Hogwarts was Quidditch, the most popular sport in the magical world. Highly dangerous, very exciting, and played on broomsticks. Harry happened to be a very good Quidditch player. He had been the youngest person in a century to be picked for one of the Hogwarts house teams. One of Harry's most prized possessions was his Nimbus 2000 racing broom. Harry put the leather case aside and picked up his last parcel. He recognized the untidy scrawl on the brown paper at once. This was from Hagrid, the Hogwarts gamekeeper. He tore off the top layer of paper and glimpsed something green and leathery. But before he could unwrap it properly, the parcel gave a strange quiver, and whatever was inside it snapped loudly, as though it had jaws. Harry froze. He knew that Hagrid would never send him anything dangerous on purpose, but then, Hagrid didn't have a normal person's view of what was dangerous. Hagrid had been known to befriend giant spiders, buy vicious, 3-headed dogs from men pubs, and sneak illegal dragon eggs into his cabin. Harry poked the parcel nervously. It snapped loudly again.
Shall we have a drink,
Harry
friend?
reached for the lamp on his bedside table, gripped it firmly in one hand, and raised it over his head, ready to strike. Then he seized the rest of the wrapping paper in his other hand and pulled. And out fell a book. Harry just had time to register its handsome green cover, emblazoned with the golden title, The Monster Book of Monsters.
What can I do for you?
Before it flipped onto its edge and scuttled sideways along the bed like some weird crab. Uh-oh, Harry muttered. The book toppled off the bed with a loud clunk and shuffled rapidly across the room. Harry followed it stealthily. The book was hiding in the dark space under his desk. Praying that the Dursleys were still fast
Come
asleep,
here!
Harry got down on his hands and knees and reached towards it. Ouch! The book snapped shut on his hand and then flapped past him, still scuttling on its covers. Harry scrambled around, threw himself forward, and managed to flatten it. Uncle Vernon gave a loud, sleepy grunt in the room next door. Hedwig and Errol watched interestedly as Harry clapped the struggling book tightly in his arms, hurried to his chest of drawers, and pulled out a belt, which he buckled tightly around it. The monster book shuddered angrily, but could no longer flap and snap, so Harry threw it down the bed and reached for Hagrid's card. Dear Harry, happy birthday. Think you might find this useful for next year. Won't say no more here. Tell you when I see you. Hope the Muggles are treating you right. All the best, Hagrid. It struck Harry as ominous that Hagrid thought a biting book would come in useful, but he put up Hagrid's card next to Ron and Hermione's, grinning more broadly than ever. Now there was only the letter from Hogwarts left. Noticing that it was rather thicker than usual, Harry slid open the envelope, pulling out the first page of parchment within, and read, Dear Mr. Potter, please note that the new school year will begin on September the 1st. The Hogwarts Express will leave from King's Cross Station Platform 9 3/4 at 11 o'clock. Third years are permitted to visit the village of Hogsmeade at certain weekends. Please give the enclosed permission form to your parents or guardians to sign. A list of books for next year is enclosed. Yours sincerely, Professor M. McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. Harry pulled out the Hogsmeade permission form and looked at it, no longer grinning. It would be wonderful to visit Hogsmeade at weekends. He knew it was an entirely wizarding village, and he had never set foot there. But how on earth was he going to persuade Uncle Vernon or Aunt Petunia to sign the form? He looked over at the alarm clock. It was now 2 o'clock in the morning. Deciding that he'd worry about the Hogsmeade form when he woke up, Harry got back into bed to cross off another day on the chart he'd made for himself, counting down the days until his return to Hogwarts. Then he took off his glasses and lay down, eyes open, facing his 3 birthday cards. Extremely unusual though he was, at that moment, Harry Potter felt just like everyone else, glad, for the first time in his life, that it was his birthday. Chapter 2. Aunt Marge's Big Mistake. Harry went down to breakfast next morning to find the 3 Dursleys already sitting around the kitchen table. They were watching a brand new television, a welcome home for the summer present for Dudley, who had been complaining loudly about the long walk between the fridge and the television in the living room. Dudley had spent most of the summer in the kitchen, his piggy little eyes fixed on the screen, and his 5 chins wobbling as he ate continually. Harry sat down between Dudley and Uncle Vernon, a large, beefy man, with very little neck and a lot of mustache. Far from wishing Harry a happy birthday, none of the Dursleys gave any sign that they had noticed Harry enter the room. But Harry was far too used to this to care. He helped himself to a piece of toast, and then looked up at the newsreader on the television, who was halfway through a report on an escaped
Shall we have a
convict.
drink, friend?
The public is warned that Black is armed and extremely dangerous. A special hotline has been set up, and any sightings of Black should be reported immediately. No need to tell us he's no good, snorted Uncle Vernon, staring over the top of his newspaper at the prisoner. Look at the state of him, the filthy layabouts. Look at his hair. He shot a nasty look sideways at Harry.
What can I do for
His
you?
untidy hair had always been a source of great annoyance to Uncle Vernon. Compared to the man on the television, however, whose gaunt face was surrounded by a matted, elbow-length tangle, Harry felt very well groomed indeed. The newsreader had reappeared. The Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries will announce today... Hang on!
Come here!
Barked Uncle Vernon, staring furiously at the newsreader. You didn't tell us where that maniac's escaped from. What use is that? The lunatic could be coming up the street right now. Aunt Petunia, who was bony and horse-faced, whipped around and peered intently out of the kitchen window. Harry knew Aunt Petunia would simply love to be the one to call the hotline number. She was the nosiest woman in the world, and spent most of her life spying on her boring, law-abiding neighbors. When will they learn? Said Uncle Vernon, pounding the table with his large purple fist. That hanging's the only way to deal with these people. Very true, said Aunt Petunia, who was still squinting into next door's runner beams. Uncle Vernon drained his teacup, glanced at his watch, and added, I'd better be off in a minute, Petunia. Marge's train gets in at 10. Harry, whose thoughts had been upstairs with his Broomstick Servicing Kit, was brought back to earth with an unpleasant bump. Aunt Marge? He blurted out. She's not coming here.
Come here!
Aunt Marge was Uncle Vernon's sister. Even though she was not a blood relative of Harry's, whose mother had been Aunt Petunia's sister, he'd been forced to call her Aunt all his life. Aunt Marge lived in the country, in a house with a large garden, where she bred bulldogs. She didn't often stay in Privet Drive, because she couldn't bear to leave her precious dogs, stood out horribly vividly in Harry's mind. At Dudley's 5th birthday party, Aunt Marge had whacked Harry around the shins with her walking stick to stop him beating Dudley at musical statues. A few years later, she had turned up at Christmas with a computerized robot for Dudley and a box of dog biscuits for Harry. On her last visit, the year before Harry had started at Hogwarts, Harry had accidentally trodden on the paw of her favorite dog. Ripper had chased Harry out into the garden and up a tree, and Aunt Marge had refused to call him off until past midnight. The memory of this incident still brought tears of laughter to Dudley's eyes.
Marge will be here for a week,
Uncle Vernon snarled.
And while we're on the subject,
He pointed a fat finger threateningly at Harry.
we need to get a few things straight before I go and collect her.
Dudley smirked and withdrew his gaze from the television. Watching Harry being bullied by Uncle Vernon was Dudley's favorite form of entertainment.
Firstly,
Growled Uncle Vernon.
you'll keep a civil tongue in your head when you're talking to Marge.
All right, said Harry bitterly. If she does when she's talking to me.
Secondly,
Said Uncle Vernon, acting as though he had not heard Harry's reply.
as Marge doesn't know anything about your abnormality, I don't want any funny things while she's here. You behave yourself. Got me?
I will if she does, said Harry through gritted teeth.
And thirdly,
Said Uncle Vernon, his mean little eyes now slits in his great purple face.
we've told Marge you attend St. Brutus's Secure Center for Incurably Criminal Boys.
What? Harry yelled.
And you'll be sticking to that story, boy, or there'll be trouble.
Spat Uncle Vernon. Harry sat there, white-faced and furious, staring at Uncle Vernon, hardly able to believe it. Aunt Marge coming for a week-long visit. It was the worst birthday present the Dursleys had ever given him, including that pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks.
Well, Petunia,
Said Uncle Vernon, getting heavily to his feet.
I'll be off to the station then. Want to come along for the ride, Dudders?
No, said Dudley. His attention had returned to the television, now that Uncle Vernon had finished threatening Harry. Daddy's got to make himself smart for his auntie, said Aunt Petunia, smoothing Dudley's thick blonde hair. Mummy's bought him a lovely new bow tie. Uncle Vernon clapped Dudley on his porky shoulder.
See you in a bit, then,
he said, and he left the kitchen. Harry, who'd been sitting in a kind of horrified trance, had a sudden idea. Abandoning his toast, he got quickly to his feet and followed Uncle Vernon to the front door. Uncle Vernon was pulling on his car coat.
I'm not taking you.
He snarled as he turned to see Harry watching him. Like I wanted to come, said Harry coldly. I want to ask you something. Uncle Vernon eyed him suspiciously. The third years at my school are allowed to visit the village sometimes, said Harry.
So?
Snapped Uncle Vernon, taking his car keys from a hook next to the door. I need you to sign the permission form, said Harry in a rush.
And why should I do that?
Sneered Uncle Vernon. Well, said Harry, choosing his words carefully. It'll be hard, pretending to Aunt Marge that I go to St. What's-its.
St. Brutus's Secure Center for Incurably Criminal Boys,
bellowed Uncle Vernon, and Harry was pleased to hear a definite note of panic in Uncle Vernon's voice. Exactly, said Harry, looking calmly up into Uncle Vernon's large purple face. It's a lot to remember. I'll have to make it sound convincing, won't I? What if I accidentally let something slip?
You'll get the stuffing knocked out of you, won't you?
Roared Uncle Vernon, advancing on Harry with his fist raised. But Harry stood his ground. Knocking the stuffing out of me won't make Aunt Marge forget what I could tell her, said Harry grimly. Uncle Vernon stopped, his fist still raised, his face an ugly puce. But if you sign my permission form, Harry went on quickly, I swear I'll remember where I'm supposed to go to school, and I'll act like I'm normal and everything. Harry could tell that Uncle Vernon was thinking it over, even if his teeth were bared, and a vein was throbbing in his temple.
Right,
he snapped finally.
I shall monitor your behavior carefully during Marge's visit. If at the end of it, you've towed the line and kept to the story, I'll sign your ready form.
He wheeled around, pulled open the front door, and slammed it so hard that one of the little panes of glass at the top fell out. Harry didn't return to the kitchen. He went back upstairs to his bedroom. If he was going to act like a real muggle, he'd better start now. Slowly and sadly, he gathered up all his presents and his birthday cards and hid them under the loose floorboard with his homework. Then he went to Hedwig's cage. Errol seemed to have recovered. He and Hedwig were both asleep, heads under their wings. Harry sighed, then poked them
What
both
can I
awake.
do for you?
Hedwig. he said gloomily. "You're gonna have to clear off for a week. Go with Errol. Ron will look after you. I'll write him a note explaining." "Don't look at me like that." Hedwig's large amber eyes were reproachful. "It's not my fault. It's the only way I'll be allowed to visit Hogsmeade with Ron and Hermione."
Come
10 minutes
here!
Later, Errol and Hedwig, who had a note to Ron bound to her leg, soared out of the window and out of sight. Harry, now feeling thoroughly miserable, put the empty cage away inside the wardrobe. But Harry didn't have long to brood. In next to no time, Aunt Petunia was shrieking up the stairs for Harry to come down and get ready to welcome their guests.
Shall we have a drink,
Something
friend?
about your hair, Aunt Petunia snapped as he reached the hall. Harry couldn't see the point of trying to make his hair lie flat. Aunt Marge loved criticizing him, so the untidier he looked, the happier she would be. All too soon, there was a crunch of gravel outside as Uncle Vernon's car pulled back into the driveway. Then the clunk of the car doors and footsteps on the garden path. "Get to the door!" Aunt Petunia hissed at Harry. A feeling of great gloom in his stomach, Harry pulled the door open. On the threshold stood Aunt Marge. She was very like Uncle Vernon, large, beefy, and purple-faced. She even had a mustache, though not as bushy as his. In one hand she held
What can
an
I do
enormous
for you?
suitcase, and tucked under the other was an old and evil-tempered bulldog.
"Where's my dudders?
Roared Aunt Marge.
Where's my Neffy Poo?"
Dudley came waddling down the hall, his blonde hair plastered flat to his fat head, and a bow tie just visible under his many chins. Aunt Marge thrust the suitcase into Harry's stomach, knocking the wind out of him, seized Dudley in a tight one-armed hug, and planted a large kiss on his cheek. Harry knew perfectly well that Dudley only put up with Aunt Marge's hugs because he was well paid for it, and sure enough, when they broke apart, Dudley had a crisp 20-pound note clutched in his fat fist.
"Petunia!"
shouted Aunt Marge, striding past Harry as though he was a hat stand. Aunt Marge and Aunt Petunia kissed, or rather, Aunt Marge bumped her large jaw against Aunt Petunia's bony cheekbone. Uncle Vernon now came in, smiling jovially as he shut the door.
"Tea, Marge?" he said. "And what will Ripper take?"
"Ripper can have some tea out of my saucer,"
said Aunt Marge, as they all trooped into the kitchen, leaving Harry alone in the hall with the suitcase. But Harry wasn't complaining. Any excuse not to be with Aunt Marge was fine by him, so he began to heave the case upstairs into the spare bedroom, taking as long as he could. By the time he got back to the kitchen, Aunt Marge had been supplied with tea and fruitcake, and Ripper was lapping noisily in the corner. Harry saw Aunt Petunia wince slightly, as specks of tea and drool flecked her clean floor. Aunt Petunia hated animals.
"Who's looking after the other dogs, Marge?"
Uncle Vernon asked.
"Oh, I've got Colonel Bubster managing them,"
boomed Aunt Marge.
"He's retired now. Good for him to have something to do. But I couldn't leave poor old Ripper. He pines if he's away from me."
Ripper began to growl again as Harry sat down. This directed Aunt Marge's attention to Harry for the first time.
"So,"
she barked.
"still here, are you?"
"Yes," said Harry.
"Don't you say yes in that ungrateful tone,"
Aunt Marge growled.
"It's damn good of Vernon and Petunia to keep you. Wouldn't have done it myself. You'd have gone straight to an orphanage if you'd been dumped on my doorstep."
Harry was bursting to say that he'd rather live in an orphanage than with the Dursleys, but the thought of the Hogsmeade form stopped him. He forced his face into a painful smile.
"Don't you smirk at me,"
boomed Aunt Marge.
"I can see you haven't improved since I last saw you. I hoped school would knock some manners into you."
She took a large gulp of tea, wiped her mustache, and said,
"Where is it that you sent him again, Vernon?"
"St. Brutus's,"
said Uncle Vernon promptly.
"It's a first-rate institution for hopeless cases."
"I see,"
said Aunt Marge.
"Do they use the cane at St. Brutus's, boy?"
She barked across the table. Uncle Vernon nodded curtly behind Aunt Marge's back. "Yes," said Harry. Then, feeling he might as well do something properly, he added, "all the time."
"Excellent,"
What can I do for you?
said Aunt Marge.
"I won't have this namby-pamby, wishy-washy nonsense about not hitting people who deserve it. A good thrashing is what's needed, in 99 cases out of 100. Have you been beaten often?
Oh, yeah, said Harry. Loads of times. Aunt Marge narrowed her eyes.
I still don't like your tone, boy, she said. If you can speak of your beatings in that casual way, they clearly aren't hitting you hard enough. Petunia, I'd write if I were you. Make it clear that you approve the use of extreme force in this boy's case.
Perhaps Uncle Vernon was worried that Harry might forget their bargain. In any case, he changed the subject abruptly.
Heard the news this morning, Marge? What about that escaped prisoner, hey?
As Aunt Marge started to make herself at home, Harry caught himself thinking almost longingly of life at number 4 without her. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia usually encouraged Harry to stay out of their way, which Harry was only too happy to do. Aunt Marge, on the other hand, wanted Harry under her eye at all times, so that she could boom out suggestions for his improvement. She delighted in comparing Harry with Dudley, and took huge pleasure in buying Dudley expensive presents, whilst glaring at Harry, as though daring him to ask why he hadn't got a present too. She also kept throwing out dark hints about what made Harry such an unsatisfactory person.
You mustn't blame yourself for the way the boys turned out, Vernon,
she said over lunch on the 3rd day.
If there's something rotten on the inside, there's nothing anyone can do about it.
Harry tried to concentrate on his food, but his hands shook and his face was starting to burn with anger. Remember the form, he told himself. Think about Hogsmeade. Don't say anything. Don't rise. Aunt Marge reached for a glass of wine.
It's one of the basic rules of breeding, she said. You see it all the time with the dogs. If there's something wrong with the bitch, there'll be something wrong with the pup.
At that moment, the wine glass Aunt Marge was holding exploded in her hand. Shards of glass flew in every direction, and Aunt Marge spluttered and blinked, her great ruddy face dripping.
Marge!
Squealed Aunt Petunia.
Marge, are you all right?
Not to worry,
grunted Aunt Marge, mopping her face with her napkin.
Must have squeezed it too hard. Did the same thing at Colonel Fopster's the other day. No need to fuss, Petunia. I have a very firm grip.
But Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon were both looking at Harry suspiciously, so he decided he'd better skip pudding and escape from the table as soon as he could. Outside in the hall, he leaned against the wall, breathing deeply. It had been a long time since he'd lost control and made something explode. He couldn't afford to let it happen again. The Hogsmeade form wasn't the only thing at stake. If he carried on like that, he'd be in trouble with the Ministry of Magic. Harry was still an underage wizard, and he was forbidden by wizard law to do magic outside school. His record wasn't exactly clean either. Only last summer he'd got an official warning, which had stated quite clearly that if the Ministry got wind of any more magic at Privet Drive, he would face expulsion from Hogwarts. He heard the Dursleys leaving the table and hurried upstairs out of the way. Harry got through the next 3 days by forcing himself to think about his handbook of do-it-yourself broom care whenever Aunt Marge started on him. This worked quite well, though it seemed to give him a glazed look, because Aunt Marge started voicing the opinion that he was mentally subnormal. At long last, the final evening of Marge's stay arrived. Aunt Petunia cooked a fancy dinner, and Uncle Vernon uncorked several bottles of wine. They got all the way through the soup and the salmon without a single mention of Harry's faults. During the lemon meringue pie, Uncle Vernon bored them all with a long talk about Grunnings, his drill-making company. Then Aunt Petunia made coffee, and Uncle Vernon brought out a bottle of brandy.
Can I tempt you, Marge?
Aunt Marge had already had a lot of wine. Her huge face was very red.
Just a small one, then,
she chuckled.
A bit more than that. A bit more. That's the boy.
Dudley was eating his 4th slice of pie. Aunt Petunia was sipping coffee with her little finger sticking out. Harry really wanted to disappear into his bedroom, but he met Uncle Vernon's angry little eyes, and he knew he would have to sit it out.
Ah,
said Aunt Marge, smacking her lips and putting the empty brandy glass back down.
Excellent nosh, Petunia. It's normally just a fry-up for me on an evening with 12 dogs to look after.
She burped richly and patted her great tweed stomach.
Pardon me, but I do like to see a healthy-sized boy,
she went on, winking at Dudley.
You'll be a proper-sized man, Dudders, like your father. Yes, I'll have a spot more brandy, Vernon. Now this one here.
She jerked her head at Harry, who felt his stomach clench. The handbook, he thought quickly.
This one's got a mean, ruddy look about him. You get that with dogs. Colonel Thupster drowned one last year. A ratty little thing it was. Weak, underbred.
Harry was trying to remember page 12 of his book, a charm to cure reluctant reversers.
It all comes down to blood. As I was saying the other day, bad blood will out. Now, I'm saying nothing against your family, Petunia.
She patted Aunt Petunia's bony hand with her shovel-like one.
But your sister was a bad egg. They turn up in the best families. Then she ran off with a wastrel. And here's the result right in front of us.
Harry was staring at his plate, a funny ringing in his ears. Grasp your broom firmly by the tail, he thought. But he couldn't remember what came next. Aunt Marge's voice seemed to be boring into him like one of Uncle Vernon's drills.
This Potter,
said Aunt Marge loudly, seizing the brandy bottle and splashing more into her glass, and over the tablecloth.
He never told me what he did.
Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia were looking extremely tense. Dudley had even looked up from his pie to gawk at his parents.
He didn't work,
said Uncle Vernon, with half a glance at Harry.
Unemployed.
As I expected,
said Aunt Marge, taking a huge swig of brandy and wiping her chin on her sleeve.
A no-account, good-for-nothing, lazy scrounger who...
He was not, said Harry suddenly. The table went very quiet. Harry was shaking all over. He had never felt so angry in his life.
More brandy!
Yelled Uncle Vernon, who had gone very white. He emptied the bottle into Aunt Marge's glass.
You boy,
he snarled at Harry.
Go to bed, go on.
No, Vernon,
hiccuped Aunt Petunia, holding up a hand, her tiny bloodshot eyes fixed on Harry's.
Go on, boy, go on. Proud of your parents, are you? They go and get themselves killed in a car crash. Drunk, I expect.
They didn't die in a car crash, said Harry, who found himself on his feet.
They died in a car crash, you nasty little liar, and left you to be a burden on their decent, hard-working relatives,
screamed Aunt Marge, swelling with fury.
You are an insolent, ungrateful little...
But Aunt Marge suddenly stopped speaking. For a moment, it looked as though words had failed her. She seemed to be swelling with inexpressible anger. But the swelling didn't stop. Her great red face started to expand. Her tiny eyes bulged, and her mouth stretched too tightly for speech. Next second, several buttons burst from her tweed jacket and pinged off the walls. She was inflating like a monstrous balloon, her stomach bursting free of her tweed waistband, each of her fingers blowing up like a salami.
Marge!
Yelled Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia together, as Aunt Marge's whole body began to rise off her chair towards the ceiling. She was entirely round now, like a vast life buoy, with piggy eyes, and her hands and feet stuck out weirdly as she drifted up into the air, making apoplectic, popping noises. Ripper came skidding into the room, barking madly.
No!
Uncle Vernon seized one of Marge's feet and tried to pull her down again, but was almost lifted from the floor himself. Next second, Ripper had leapt forward and sunk his teeth into Uncle Vernon's leg. Harry tore from the dining room before anyone could stop him, heading for the cupboard under the stairs. The cupboard door burst magically open as he reached it. In seconds, he had heaved his trunk to the front door. He sprinted upstairs and threw himself under the bed, fetched up the loose floorboard, and grabbed the pillowcase full of his books and birthday presents. He wriggled out, seized Hedwig's empty cage, and dashed back downstairs to his trunk, just as Uncle Vernon burst out of the dining room, his trouser leg in bloody tatters.
Come back in here,
he bellowed.
Come back and put her right.
But a reckless rage had come over Harry. He kicked his trunk over, pulled out his wand, and pointed at Uncle Vernon. She deserved it, Harry said, breathing very fast. She deserved what she got. You keep away from me. He fumbled behind him for the catch on the door. I'm going, said Harry. I've had enough. And the next moment, he was out in the dark, quiet street, heaving his heavy trunk behind him, Hedwig's cage under his arm. night bus. Harry was several streets away before he collapsed onto a low wall in Magnolia Crescent, panting from the effort of dragging his trunk. He sat quite still, anger still surging through him, listening to the frantic thumping of his heart. But after 10 minutes alone in the dark street, a new emotion took over him. Panic. Whichever way he looked at it, he had never been in a worse fix. He was stranded, quite alone, in a dark Muggle world, with absolutely nowhere to go. And the worst of it was, he had just done serious magic, which meant that he was almost certainly expelled from Hogwarts. He had broken the decree for the restriction of underage wizardry so badly, he was surprised Ministry of Magic representatives weren't swooping down on him where he sat. Harry shivered and looked up and down Magnolia Crescent. What was going to happen to him? Would he be arrested? Or would he simply be outlawed from the wizarding world? He thought of Ron and Hermione, and his heart sank even lower. Harry was sure that, criminal or not, Ron and Hermione would want to help him now. But they were both abroad, and with Hedwig gone, he had no means of contacting them. He didn't have any Muggle money either. There was a little wizard gold in the money bag at the bottom of his trunk, but the rest of the fortune his parents had left him was stored in a vault at Gringotts Wizarding Bank in London. He'd never be able to drag his trunk all the way to London, unless... He looked down at his wand, which he was still clutching in his hand. If he was already expelled, his heart was now thumping painfully fast. A bit more magic couldn't hurt. He had the invisibility cloak he had inherited from his father. What if he bewitched the trunk to make it feather light, tied it to his broomstick, covered himself in the cloak, and flew to London? Then he could get the rest of his money out of his vault, and begin his life as an outcast. It was a horrible prospect. But he couldn't sit on this wall forever, or he'd find himself trying to explain to Muggle police why he was out in the dead of night with a trunk full of spellbooks and a broomstick.
Shall we have a drink,
Harry opened
friend?
his trunk again and pushed the contents aside, looking for the invisibility cloak. But before he had found it, he straightened up suddenly, looking around him once more. A funny prickling on the back of his neck had made Harry feel he was being watched. But the street appeared to be deserted, and no light shone from any of the large square houses. He bent over his trunk again, but almost immediately stood up once more. His hand clenched on his wand. He had sensed rather than heard it. Someone or something was standing in the narrow gap between the garage and the fence behind him. Harry squinted at the black alleyway. If only it would move, then he'd know whether it was just a stray cat or something else. Lumos, Harry muttered, and a light appeared at the end of his wand, almost dazzling him. He held it high over his head, and the pebble-dashed walls of number 2 suddenly sparkled. The garage door gleamed, and between them, Harry saw, quite distinctly, the hulking outline of something very big, with wide, gleaming eyes. Harry stepped backwards. His legs hit his trunk and he tripped. His wand flew out of his hand, and he flung out an arm to break his fall, and he landed hard in the gutter. There was a deafening bang, and Harry threw up his hands to shield his eyes against the sudden blinding light. With a yell, he rolled back onto the pavement, just in time. A second later, a gigantic pair of wheels and headlights had screeched to a halt exactly where Harry had just been lying. They belonged, as Harry saw when he raised his head, to a triple-decker, violently purple bus, which had appeared out of thin air. Gold lettering over the windscreen spelled, "The Night Bus." For a split second, Harry wondered if he had been knocked silly by his fall. Then a conductor in a purple uniform leapt out of the bus and began to speak loudly to the night. "Welcome to the Night Bus. Emergency transport for the stranded witch or wizard. Just stick out your wand hand, step on board, and we can take you anywhere you want to go. My name is Stan Shunpike, and I will be your conductor this evening." The conductor stopped abruptly. He had just caught sight of Harry, who was still sitting on the ground. Harry snatched up his wand again and scrambled to his feet. Close to, he saw that Stan Shunpike was only a few years older than he was, 18 or 19 at most, with large protruding ears and a fair few pimples.
What are you doing down there?
Said Stan, dropping his professional manner. Fell over, said Harry.
First, you must learn to harvest what you need from your surroundings in order to survive. You must learn to harvest what you need from your surroundings or even some barrels and strike them. Find some bushes, to gather useful items, or even some barrels and strike them to gather useful items.
He suddenly remembered why he had fallen over, and turned around quickly to stare at the alleyway, between the garage and fence. The night bus's headlamps were flooding it with light, and it was empty.
What you looking at?
Said Stan. There was a big black thing, said Harry, pointing uncertainly into the gap. Like a dog, but massive. He looked around at Stan, whose mouth was slightly open. With a feeling of unease, Harry saw Stan's eyes move to the scar on Harry's forehead.
What's that on your head?
Said Stan abruptly. Nothing, said Harry quickly, flattening his hair over his scar. If the Ministry of Magic was looking for him, he didn't want to make it too easy for them.
What's your name?
Stan persisted. Neville Longbottom, said Harry, saying the first name that came to his head. So this bus, he went on quickly, hoping to distract Stan. Did you say it goes anywhere?
Yep,
said Stan proudly.
Anywhere you like, as long as it's on land. Can't do nothing underwater. Here,
he said, looking suspicious again.
You did flag us down, didn't you? Took out your wand and didn't you?
Yes, said Harry quickly. Listen, how much would it be to get to London?
11 sickles,
said Stan.
For 15, you get a hot chocolate. And for 15, you get an hot water bottle. And a toothbrush in the color of your choice.
Harry rummaged once more in his trunk, extracted his money bag, and shoved some silver into Stan's hand. He and Stan then lifted his trunk, with Hedwig's cades balanced on top, up the stairs of the bus. There were no seats. Instead, half a dozen brass beds stood beside the curtained windows. Candles were burning in brackets beside each bed, illuminating the wood-paneled walls. A tiny wizard in a nightcap at the rear of the bus muttered,
"Not now, thanks. I'm pickling some slugs,"
and rolled over in his sleep.
"You have this one,"
Stan whispered, shoving Harry's trunk right under the bed behind the driver, who was sitting in an armchair in front of the steering wheel.
"This is our driver, Ernie Pryning. This is Neville Longbottom.
How are you
Ernie
today?"
Prane, an elderly wizard wearing very thick glasses, nodded to Harry, who nervously flattened his fringe again and sat down on his bed.
"Take her away, Ern,"
said Stan, sitting down in the armchair next to
Losing
Ernie's.
one's way.
There was another tremendous bang, and next moment Harry found himself flat on his bed, thrown backwards by the speed of the night bus. Pulling himself up, Harry stared out of the dark window and saw that they were now bowling along a completely different street. Stan was watching Harry's stunned face with great enjoyment.
"This is where we was before you flagged us down,"
he said.
"Where are we, Ern? Somewhere in Wales?"
"Ah," said Ernie. "How come the muggles don't hear the bus?" said Harry.
"Them,"
How are you today?
said Stan contemptuously.
"Don't listen properly, do they? Don't look properly, neither. Never knows nothing, they don't. Let's go wake up Madame Marge, Stan,"
said Ern.
"We'll be in Aberdavie in a minute."
Stan passed Harry's bed and disappeared up a narrow wooden staircase. Harry was still looking out of the window, feeling increasingly nervous. Ernie didn't seem to have mastered the use of the steering wheel. The night bus kept mounting the pavement, but it didn't hit anything. Lines of lampposts, letterboxes, and bins jumped out of the way as it approached, and back into position once it had passed. Stan came back downstairs, followed by a faintly green witch wrapped in a traveling cloak.
"Here you go, Madame Marge,"
said Stan happily, as Ern stamped on the brake and the bed slid a foot or so towards the front of the bus. Madame Marge clapped a handkerchief to her mouth and tottered down the steps. Stan threw her bag out after her and rammed the doors shut. There was another loud bang, and they were thundering down a narrow country lane, trees leaping out of their way. Harry wouldn't have been able to sleep even if he had been traveling on the bus that didn't keep banging loudly and jumping 100 miles at a time. His stomach churned as he turned back to wondering what was going to happen to him, and whether the Dursleys had managed to get Aunt Marge off the ceiling yet. Harry had unfurled a copy of the Daily Prophet, and was now reading with his tongue between his teeth. A large photograph of a sunken-faced man with long, matted hair blinked slowly at Harry on the front page. He looked strangely familiar.
Losing one's way
That man,
could be worse than
said
death.
Harry, forgetting his troubles for a moment. He was on the Muggle news. Stanley turned to the front page and chuckled.
Sirius Black?
He said, nodding.
Of course he was on the Muggle news, Neville. Where you been?
He gave a superior sort of chuckle at the blank look on Harry's face, removed the front page, and handed it to Harry.
Losing one's way
You ought to read
could
the
be
paper
worse
more,
than
Neville.
death.
Harry held the paper up to the candlelight and read. Black still at large. Sirius Black, possibly the most infamous prisoner ever to be held in Azkaban Fortress, is still eluding capture. The Ministry of Magic confirmed
Never
today.
forget who you are.
We are doing all we can to recapture Black,
said the Minister for Magic, Cornelius Fudge, this morning.
and we beg the magical community to remain calm.
Fudge has been criticized by some members of the International Federation of Warlocks for informing the Muggle Prime Minister of the crisis.
Well, really, I had to, don't you know?
Said an irritable Fudge.
Black is mad. He's a danger to anyone who crosses him, magic or Muggle. I have the Prime Minister's assurance that he will not breathe a word of Black's true identity to anyone. And let's face it, who'd believe him if he did?
While Muggles have been told that Black is carrying a gun, a kind of metal wand which Muggles use to kill each other, the magical community lives in fear of a massacre, like the one of 12 years ago, when Black murdered 13 people with a single curse. Harry looked into the shadowed eyes of Sirius Black, the only part of the sunken face that seemed alive. Harry had never met a vampire, but he'd seen pictures of them in his Defense Against the Dark Arts classes, and Black, with his waxy white skin, looked just like one.
Scary looking thing, isn't he?
Said Stan, who had been watching Harry read. He murdered 13 people? Said Harry, handing the page back to Stan. With one curse?
Yeah,
Said Stan.
in front of witnesses and all. Broad daylight. Big trouble it caused, didn't it, Ern?
Yeah, said Ern darkly. Stan swiveled in his chair, his hands on the back, and better to look at Harry.
Black was a big supporter, you know,
He said. What, Voldemort? Said Harry without thinking. Even Stan's pimples went white. Ern jerked the steering wheel so hard that the whole farmhouse had to jump aside to avoid the bus.
Yeah, your tree.
Yelped Stan.
What'd you say that for?
Sorry, said Harry hastily. Sorry, I forgot,
Forgot?
said Stan weakly.
Blimey, my skull's that fast.
So Black was a supporter of you-know-who? Harry prompted apologetically. Yeah, said Stan, still rubbing his chest.
Yeah, that's right. Very close to you-know-who, you say. Anyway, a little airy part. Put pay to you-know-who.
Harry nervously flattened his fringe down again.
All you-know-who's supporters was tracked down, wasn't they, Ern? Most of them knew it was all over, with you-know-who gone. And they came quiet. They're not Sirius Black. I already thought you'd be second in command once you-know-who had taken over. Anyway, they cornered Black in the middle of a street, full of muggles, and Black took out his wand. And he blasted half the street apart, and a wizard got it. And so a dozen muggles what got in the way. Horrible, eh? And you know what Black did then?
Stan continued in a dramatic whisper. What? Said Harry.
Laughed,
Said Stan.
just stood there and laughed. And when reinforcements from the Ministry of Magic got there, he went with them quiet as anything. Still laughing his head off. Because he's mad, ain't he, Ern? Ain't he, Ern? Ain't he mad? If he wasn't when he went to Azkaban, he will be now, said Ern in his slow voice. I'd blow myself up before I set foot in that place. Serves him right, mind, after what he did. They had a job covering it up, didn't they, Ern?
Stan said.
Whole street blown up and all them muggles dead. What was it they said happened, Ern? Gas explosion, grunted Ernie. And now he's out, said Stan, examining the newspaper picture of Black's gaunt face again. Never been a breakout from Azkaban before, as there Ern. Beats me how he did it. Frightening, eh? Mine, I don't fancy his chances against them Azkaban guards, eh, Ern? Ernie suddenly shivered. Talk about something else, Stan. There's a good lad. Them Azkaban guards give me the collywomps. Stan put the paper away reluctantly, and Harry leaned against the window of the night bus, feeling worse than ever. He couldn't help imagining what Stan might be telling his passengers in a few nights' time. Hear about that Harry Potter? Blew up his aunt. We had him in here on the night bus, didn't we, Ern? He was trying to run for it. He, Harry, had broken wizard law just like Sirius Black. Was inflating Aunt Marge bad enough to land him in Azkaban? Harry didn't know anything about the wizard prison, though everyone he'd ever heard speak of it did so in the same fearful tone. Hagrid, the Hogwarts gamekeeper, had spent 2 months there only last year. Harry wouldn't soon forget the look of terror on Hagrid's face when he had been told where he was going, and Hagrid was one of the bravest people Harry knew. The night bus rolled through the darkness, scattering bushes and bollards, telephone boxes and trees. And Harry lay, restless and miserable, on his feather bed. After a while, Stan remembered that Harry had paid for hot chocolate, but poured it all over Harry's pillow when the bus moved abruptly from Anglesa to Aberdeen. One by one, wizards and witches in dressing gowns and slippers descended from the upper floors to leave the bus. They all looked very pleased to go. Finally, Harry was the only passenger left. Right then, Neville, said Stan, clapping his hands. Whereabouts in London? Diagon Alley, said Harry. Right-o, said Stan. Hold tight then. Bang. They were thundering along Charing Cross Road. Harry sat up and watched buildings and benches squeezing themselves out of the night bus's way. The sky was getting a little lighter. He would lie low for a couple hours, go to Gringotts the moment it opened, then set off. Where, he didn't know. Ern slammed on the brakes, and the night bus skidded to a halt in front of a small and shabby-looking pub. The Leaky Cauldron, behind which lay the magical entrance to Diagon Alley. Thanks, said Harry to Ern. He jumped down the steps and helped Stan lower his trunk and Hedwig's cage onto the pavement. Well, said Harry, bye then. But Stan wasn't paying attention. Still standing in the doorway to the bus, he was goggling at the shadowy entrance to the Leaky Cauldron. There you are, Harry, said a voice. Before Harry could turn, he felt a hand on his shoulder. At the same time, Stan shouted, Blimey, Ern, come here, come here! Harry looked up at the owner of the hand on his shoulder, and felt a bucket full of ice cascade into his stomach. He had walked right into Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic himself. Stan leapt onto the pavement beside him. What'd you call Neville, Minister? He said excitedly. Fudge, a portly little man in a long, pinstriped cloak, looked cold and exhausted. Neville, he repeated, frowning. This is Harry Potter. I knew it, Stan shouted gleefully. Ern! Guess who Neville is, Ern? He's Harry Potter. I can see his scar. Yes, said Fudge testily. Well, I'm very glad the night bus picked Harry up. But he and I need to step inside the Leaky Cauldron now. Fudge increased the pressure on Harry's shoulder, and Harry found himself being steered inside the pub. A stooping figure bearing a lantern appeared through the door behind the bar. It was Tom, the wizened, toothless landlord. You've got him, Minister? Said Tom. Will you want anything else? Beer? Brandy? Perhaps a pot of tea, said Fudge, who still hadn't let go of Harry. There was a loud scraping and puffing from behind them, and Stan and Ern appeared, carrying Harry's trunk and Hedwig's cage, and looking around excitedly. How come you didn't tell us who you were, eh, Neville? Said Stan, beaming at Harry, while Ernie's owlish face peered interestingly over Stan's shoulder. And a private parlor, please, Tom, said Fudge pointedly. Bye, Harry said miserably to Stan and Ern, as Tom beckoned Fudge towards the passage that led from the bar. "Bye, Neville," called Stan. Fudge marched Harry along the narrow passage, after Tom's lantern, and then into a small parlor. Tom clicked his fingers. A fire burst into life in the grate, and he bowed himself out of the room. "Sit down, Harry,"